Lesson 2, Recording Your First Macro. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the options in the Record Macro dialog. How to pick a good macro name, how to assign your macro to a shortcut key, and how to choose where to store your macro. So macros are good when you have to automate a series of tasks. Maybe you have 4 or 5 steps and you'd like to reduce those 4 or 5 steps down to a single keystroke. For example, I was doing a seminar in Chicago and someone there said, hey, look, we have this situation where we have to choose cells that we're going to audit. We have to mark these records for audit. And the company standard says that we're going to take that number and put it in bold. So we choose the bold icon. And then we change the font color from the regular color to a blue color. We change the background of the cell to a light blue. And then we go in and change the borders. Now, the borders that are available to us in the borders drop-down aren't good enough, so we always have to go in to basically format cells, go back to the border tab, choose a thick border, choose dark blue, and put that border on the top and bottom of the cell. And he says, it takes me forever to go through and do all of these steps. It would be great if I could basically apply this format in a single keystroke. And that's what a macro is perfect at doing. So we can turn on the macro recorder and record the steps of doing those 5 commands and then play them back by using a shortcut key. If you want to work along, I want you to select one cell, and it's very important that while you're recording the macro that you do not select any other cells. I want you to select a cell first. We're going to turn on the macro recorder, do all the steps to that cell, and then turn off the macro recorder without choosing any other cells. So we choose our one cell, and we're going to go back to the Developer tab in the ribbon, and we're going to use the Record Macro button. Now I'll point out that the Record Macro button is actually in 3 places in the interface. It's here on the Developer tab. It's also down in the status bar, and it's also on the right side of the View tab under the Macros drop-down, Record Macro. All 3 of these icons are exactly identical, so you can use any of them that you like. We'll choose Record Macro, and that's how we get to the Record Macro dialog box. Now, a few things we have to decide here. First of all, the macro name. Now, one rule with macro names is that you cannot use any spaces in the macro name. So I would really like to call this macro Format Blue. We certainly don't want to call it Macro 1 because as you start recording more and more macros, then you're just going to have a series of macros called Macro 1, Macro 2, Macro 3, and it'll be hard several months from now to remember exactly what it was that Macro 1 or Macro 6 did. So we always want to give it a descriptive name. And because we're not allowed to use a space, what I do is I put it in something called camel case. Camel case capitalizes the first letter of each word but leaves the spaces out. So there you can see Format Blue. And because the B in blue is capitalized, well, it's easy enough to see that that's a second word, and it helps with readability. A shortcut key. Now the shortcut key is the way to invoke the macro very quickly. If you think about it, Format Blue, well, Control B would be a great shortcut key, except that Control B is already used. Control B is what? Bold. And if we would assign this macro to be Control B, well, then anyone who uses this workbook will keep hitting Control B to try and do bold, and it would apply all this formatting. That wouldn't be a good situation at all. As you look at the letters on the keyboard, most of those letters are already assigned to shortcut keys. For example, Control C for cut, Control S for save, Control I for italics. It turns out the only 2 that are available are K and L. And you have to decide, okay, with only 2 shortcut keys left, do I really want to use one of those up? And plus, how will Control K or Control L ever make me think of Format Blue? Well, the solution here is that the shifted shortcut keys are all available. So if you want to hold down Shift and press B, then you're assigning it to a shortcut key of Control Shift B, still easy enough to hit, and we're good to go. The next question, where do we want to store the macro? Do we store it in this workbook, in a new workbook or in something called the Personal Macro Workbook? Well, if you would store the macro in this workbook, it would only be available when this workbook is open. If this is something that you're going to have to do in every workbook that you're ever working in, or in many workbooks that you're ever working in, this would be a great macro to store in the Personal Macro Workbook. The Personal Macro Workbook is a hidden workbook that gets opened every time that you open an Excel, and it's a great place to store all of your macros. The description, this is completely optional, but it will help if months from now you come back and say, well, what the heck was I doing? What does the Format Blue macro do? There you go. That's a suitable description. Okay, now we want to plan out our steps, and in this case, it's going to be relatively easy. We're going to go back to the Home tab. We're going to use the bold icon, dark blue font, light blue background, and then go into the Format Cells dialog box to access the borders. Again, remember, once we click OK, the macro recorder is on. We don't want to do anything else. We don't want to be interrupted. We don't want to have the phone ring. We don't want to have our manager come in and ask us to go open some other file, because all of those steps would get recorded in the macro. So we'd really like a nice, perfect, uninterrupted 30 seconds of silence while we record this macro. Also, I want to remind you not to select another cell. Whatever cell you have selected, I want you to format that particular cell. So here, I'm formatting F4. That's the cell that I'm going to format. So I click OK. The macro recorder is actually running. The only indication we have that the macro recorder is running, on the Developer tab, the recording button changes to Stop Recording. Also down here in the status bar, the Record Macro icon changes to a square. Basically, this is kind of like the Stop button on a VCR. Okay, so we're going to go back to the Home tab. We're going to choose the bold icon. By the way, you could use Control B instead of using the icon. I'll use the light blue background, the dark blue font. I'm going to use the dialog launcher in the font group to open the Format Cells dialog. We'll go to Border, choose the thick border, choose dark blue, and then apply that to the top and bottom of the range. Click OK, and you see that our cell is now perfectly formatted. Again, we don't want to select another cell while we're recording the macro. Simply come down here and click Stop Recording, and we should be good to go. We now have recorded our first macro. It's time to test it. So let's go select another cell and press the shortcut key, Control-Shift-B, and sure enough, it plays back those steps, and in one keystroke, we've done the 5 commands. That's the basics of the macro recorder. You have a series of steps. You'd like to automate those steps and have Excel do them very quickly in response to one command. That's what a macro will do. So you can try this. You can choose another cell, Control-Shift-B, choose another cell, Control-Shift-B, and so on. It's interesting. What would happen if you just selected a bunch of cells? Control-Shift-B. Well, take a look. The macro recorder successfully put them in bold. It successfully changed the font color and the background color, but it only put the border on the top and bottom of the range, because that's what we did when we were recording the individual cell in the macro recorder. Okay, so there you have it, your very first macro. Remember, to start the macro recorder, we go to the Developer tab and use Record Macro, or the Record Macro button down here. Choose a macro name that's meaningful, but it can't have any spaces. Think about your shortcut keys. Remember, the shifted shortcut keys are all available to you. And then the big decision, do we want to store this so that way the macro is only available when this workbook is open, or when it's available for all workbooks? In that case, it goes to the Personal Macro Workbook. In our next lesson, we'll take a look at various ways to run our macro other than the shortcut key. I hope you found that helpful, and thanks for watching.
Looking to advance your career by acquiring new skills? Tired of expensive off-site training programs? Wish you could learn from the best instructors in the industry? Look no further than live lessons. Self-paced, personal video instruction by the world's leading technology publishers. Each live lesson comes with a DVD featuring 3 to 4 hours of instructor-led classroom training, sample program code that allows you to work along with your personal instructor, and an example-rich study guide. Live lessons allow you to watch the entire course from start to finish, or navigate directly to any of the individual lessons. You'll literally watch over the shoulder of your instructor as he shows you how to build state-of-the-art applications. Live lessons, the power of the world's leading technology experts at your fingertips. To learn more, visit mylivelessons.com today.